Hey guys, tonight we're slipping beneath the starched collars and tightly laced corsets of Victorian England. We're opening the drawer they never wanted you to see. The one filled with secrets, contradictions, and a whole lot of messy humanity hiding under all that moral posturing. You've probably heard the stereotypes. Victorians were prudes. They covered piano legs because they were too suggestive. They never talked about sex, never thought about it, and certainly never enjoyed it. But here's the thing, that's mostly fiction. The Victorians were absolutely obsessed with sex. They just wrapped that obsession in layers of denial, medical jargon, and social shame so thick you need a crowbar to pry it open. Tonight, you're going to discover what sex was really like in an age that preached purity while practicing something else entirely. You'll walk through bedrooms where brides were told to endure rather than enjoy. You'll stand on street corners where desperate women sold their bodies just to eat. You'll peer into doctors' offices where treatments for female desire were both bizarre and violating. And you'll meet the people, gay, straight, radical, terrified, who navigated this world of double standards and survived. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing this little community spans the globe, all of us drifting off together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in London, 1850. The air smells like coal smoke and horse manure. Gas lamps flicker on wet cobblestones, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls. This is the heart of the Victorian era, an empire at its peak, a society that believed it had perfected civilization itself. But scratch that polished surface, and you'll find something much more complicated. Because the Victorians didn't invent sexual repression, they just turned it into an art form. Here's a well-known fact. Queen Victoria herself wasn't the prude history made her out to be. She adored her husband Albert, wrote passionately about their physical relationship in her journals, and had 9 children. She once told her eldest daughter that the intimacy of marriage was the highest happiness. Yet somehow, her name became shorthand for an entire culture of sexual shame. Why? Partly because of timing. The Victorian age coincided with the rise of the evangelical movement, which preached moral purity and self-control. Middle-class families, newly wealthy from industry, wanted to distinguish themselves from the immoral working classes. Propriety became a status symbol. But here's the eccentric curiosity. While respectable Victorians clutched their pearls in public, they were quietly buying up erotic novels, visiting brothels, and experimenting with every form of birth control they could get their hands on. Historians still argue whether the Victorian obsession with covering up furniture legs ever actually happened, or if it was just a myth invented by later generations to mock them. Either way, the image stuck, and it obscured a much messier, more human truth. The truth is that Victorians had sex. Lots of it. They just weren't allowed to talk about it honestly. Women were told they shouldn't enjoy it, that sexual desire was a male affliction and female purity meant passivity. Men were told their urges were natural but dangerous, needing constant control lest they descend into animalistic behavior. And anyone who didn't fit into those neat categories, they learned to hide. The rules were suffocating, but people are resilient. They found ways to survive, to love, to rebel. You're about to meet them. You'll hear the voices that were silenced. You'll see the bodies that were controlled, punished, or erased from history. And you'll understand how the Victorian bedroom became a battleground, not just between husbands and wives, but between individuals and an entire system designed to regulate desire. So take a deep breath. Let your shoulders drop. This isn't a story with easy villains or heroes. It's a story about ordinary people trying to navigate extraordinary repression. And maybe, just maybe, you'll recognize some echoes of their struggles in the world you live in now. Because the Victorians didn't just live in the past. Their ghosts still whisper in the way we talk about sex, shame, and who gets to control desire. But that's a thought for later. For now, you're just here to listen, to drift, to let the story carry you into sleep. The marriage bed was supposed to be sacred, a place of duty, procreation, and, if you were lucky, companionship. But for many Victorian brides, the wedding night was the most terrifying moment of their lives. You're a young woman now, maybe 18 or 19. You've been raised by a mother who told you nothing. Absolutely nothing. Your education in matters of intimacy amounts to whispered warnings about wifely duties and vague references to pain that must be endured. Some girls went to their marriage beds believing babies came from prolonged kissing. Others thought they'd be cut open on their wedding night. The ignorance wasn't accidental. It was the plan. Middle-class Victorian society believed that female innocence was a virtue worth preserving at any cost. Knowledge about sex was considered corrupting, unwomanly, dangerous. So you walked down the aisle in white lace, clutching flowers, having no idea what awaited you. Here's the well-known fact. The phrase, "lie back and think of England," actually comes from this era, though historians debate whether Lady Hillingdon truly wrote it in her diary. The sentiment, however, was real. Women were told their role was passive endurance, not participation or pleasure. Sexual desire in women was considered pathological, a sign of mental illness or moral corruption. The ideal Victorian wife submitted without complaint and certainly without enjoyment. Doctors published marriage manuals that read more like medical procedures than guides to intimacy. William Acton, a prominent physician, claimed that the majority of women, happily for them, are not very much troubled with sexual feeling of any kind. He genuinely believed this, or at least he wrote it down and expected people to believe him. But here's the eccentric curiosity. Some Victorian wedding nights involve a practice called bundling, inherited from rural traditions, where couples would sleep in the same bed before marriage, fully clothed, sometimes with a wooden board between them. It was supposed to build intimacy without temptation. Whether it worked is anyone's guess. The wedding night itself often became a disaster of miscommunication and trauma. Husbands, themselves often ignorant or nervous, approached their brides with the bedside manner of men who'd learned everything from other men's boasting or pornographic novels. Brides, terrified and unprepared, sometimes fought back or fainted. Some marriages were never consummated at all. Others began with such violence or clumsiness that women spent the rest of their lives dreading their husband's touch. And nobody talked about it. You couldn't complain to your mother. She told you to endure. You couldn't talk to friends. Propriety forbade it. You certainly couldn't see a doctor without humiliation. So you endured. Night after night, year after year. Historians still argue whether Victorian women were truly as sexually repressed as the literature suggests, or whether private diaries and letters reveal a more complex picture of negotiation, pleasure, and even resistance within marriages. Some women did find joy in their marriages. Some learned to communicate with their husbands. Some discovered their own desire despite everything society told them. But those stories were exceptions, not the rule. The rule was silence. The rule was duty. The rule was that your body belonged to your husband the moment you said, "I do," and your feelings about that were irrelevant. You're lying in that marriage bed now, in your white nightgown, staring at the ceiling. Your husband is beside you, snoring. You're wondering if this is all there is. Wondering if the rest of your life will feel like this, like something happening to you rather than with you. And in the morning, you'll wake up and play the role of the contented wife. Because that's what good women do. They smile. They manage the household. They bear children. They never, ever admit that the sacred marriage bed feels more like a prison. But the worst was still to come. Because when women struggled with their marital duties, when they showed reluctance or pain or, heaven forbid, desire at the wrong times, there was a whole medical establishment waiting to fix them. Remember this feeling of helplessness, of being trapped in your own body. You'll need to remember it for what comes next. But for now, just breathe. Let the tension in your shoulders ease. You're safe here, in this moment, listening to a story that ended more than a century ago. Those women survived. Some even thrived in their own ways. And their whispers echo forward to remind you that you're not alone in whatever battles you face in your own life. But that's a thought for daylight. For now, just drift. The doctor will see you now, in your bedroom, with your husband present. You're lying on your own bed, but it doesn't feel like yours anymore. It feels like an examination table. Victorian medicine had a peculiar obsession with women's bodies, specifically with diagnosing and treating any behavior that deviated from perfect, passive femininity. And the treatment often happened in the most intimate spaces of your home. You're a middle-class wife now, maybe 25 years old. You've been married for several years, and you've started experiencing what your husband calls difficulties. Maybe you've been irritable. Maybe you've complained of headaches or fatigue. Maybe you've shown reluctance in the bedroom one too many times. Maybe you've expressed opinions a bit too forcefully at dinner. Your husband has called the family physician. Here's the well-known fact. Hysteria was one of the most commonly diagnosed conditions in Victorian medicine, and it was applied almost exclusively to women. The word comes from the Greek hystra, meaning uterus, because doctors genuinely believed women's reproductive organs controlled their mental state. Symptoms of hysteria could include anything from fainting to insomnia, nervousness to sexual desire, depression to having too many opinions. Basically, if you were a woman experiencing any emotion other than placid contentment, you might be hysterical, and hysteria required treatment. The doctor arrives at your home carrying his black leather bag. He's respectable, educated, probably in his 50s. He speaks to your husband first, in the parlor, while you wait upstairs. They discuss you as if you're not quite a full person, more like a malfunctioning piece of household equipment that needs repair. Then you're called in. The examination is humiliating. You're asked invasive questions about your monthly cycles, your marital relations, your dreams, your thoughts. The doctor probes and palpates, sometimes with your husband watching to ensure the examination is proper. Here's the eccentric curiosity. Some Victorian doctors prescribed pelvic massage as a treatment for hysteria, manually stimulating women to what we now recognize as orgasm, though they called it hysterical paroxysm. Doctors considered this tedious medical work, not sexual, and eventually invented vibrating devices to save their hands from cramping. Yes, the vibrator was invented as a medical instrument. Historians still argue whether doctors truly didn't recognize what they were doing, or whether this was elaborate theater allowing women to experience pleasure under the guise of treatment. Either way, it reveals the absurdity of a culture that denied female sexuality so thoroughly that it could only exist as a symptom to be cured. But medical intervention didn't stop at massage. Some doctors prescribed bed rest, weeks or months of lying immobile in a darkened room, forbidden from reading, writing, or thinking too much. Others recommended removal from family and friends, institutionalization, or even more invasive procedures. Hydrotherapy was popular, blasting women with high-pressure water jets, alternating between ice-cold and scalding temperatures, supposedly to shock the uterus back into proper behavior. Some physicians advocated for cauterization of the cervix or clitoris to reduce excessive desire. And in the most extreme cases, surgical removal of the ovaries or clitoris was performed, a procedure that left women physically mutilated in the name of mental health. You're lying in your bed now, listening to the doctor explain to your husband that you need more strict routine, less mental stimulation, and perhaps a course of tonics containing morphine or cocaine. These medicines were sold openly, marketed to women as cure-alls for nervous exhaustion. They were addictive, of course, but addiction was preferable to hysteria, apparently. Your husband nods seriously, taking notes. You're not asked your opinion. You're the patient, the problem, the one whose body and mind have betrayed proper feminine behavior. The doctor packs his instruments, accepts his payment, and promises to return next week. You're left alone with instructions to rest, to submit, to be good. And you realize something terrible. There's no way out. If you obey, You disappear into invalidism and drug compliance. If you resist, you're proving you're hysterical, which justifies even more extreme interventions. The system is designed to break you either way. But remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we might talk about from ancient Egypt? Victorian medicine was sometimes just as bizarre, just wrapped in the authority of modern science. The white coats and medical degrees didn't make the treatments any less barbaric. They just made them official. You close your eyes and try to imagine a world where doctors listen to women instead of diagnosing them, where your body is your own, where exhaustion is recognized as exhaustion, not mental illness. But that world feels impossibly far away. For now, you have to survive this one day at a time, one humiliating examination at a time, one dose of medicine at a time, until you can find a moment, a space, a breath of your own. Let that breath come now, slow and steady. You're here, in the present, where bodies belong to the people living in them, where medicine has evolved, however imperfectly, where those Victorian bedrooms are just memories. Painful ones, but memories nonetheless. You're walking through London at night now. The year is 1860, and the streets tell a different story than the parlors and bedrooms. Gas lamps cast yellow pools of light onto wet pavement. Carriages rattle past, their drivers looking straight ahead. And on nearly every corner, in every shadow, women are waiting. Prostitution was the empire's dirty secret, except it wasn't really a secret at all. Everyone knew. They just pretended not to. You're one of these women now, standing in the cold, wearing a dress that's brighter than respectable women would dare, cut lower than propriety allows. Your feet ache in thin boots. You haven't eaten since yesterday morning, and you're hoping tonight brings enough customers to pay your rent before your landlord throws you out. Here's the well-known fact. Historians estimate that in the 1850s and 1860s, 1 in every 16 women in London engaged in prostitution at some point. Some full-time, some occasionally when other work dried up. The numbers were staggering. Perhaps 80,000 women in London alone. This wasn't a marginal problem. This was industrial-scale survival sex, driven by an economy that paid women so little for legitimate work that selling their bodies became a rational choice. A seamstress might earn 6 shillings a week, barely enough to rent a room and eat 1 meal a day. A prostitute could earn that in a single night. The math was brutal but simple, and yet Victorian society maintained the fiction that these women were moral degenerates who'd chosen sin over virtue. Nobody wanted to discuss the systemic forces, poverty, lack of education, limited employment options, sexual double standards, that created this massive underground economy. It was easier to call the women fallen and move on. You watch a well-dressed gentleman approach. He's probably someone's husband, someone's father. During the day, he'd cross the street to avoid acknowledging you. But here, in the dark, he wants what you're selling. The transaction is quick, mechanical, joyless. Afterward, he walks away without looking back. You count the coins in your hand and calculate how many more men you'll need tonight. Here's the eccentric curiosity. Victorian prostitutes had their own slang and hierarchies. Dolly mops were part-time sex workers, shop girls, or servants who supplemented their income. Bunters worked the lowest tier, often homeless and desperate. And at the top were the courtesans, educated, elegant women who entertained wealthy men in private apartments, sometimes achieving a strange kind of celebrity. But most women were somewhere in the middle, neither destitute nor glamorous, just trying to survive. The locations varied too. Some women worked the streets, propositioning men directly. Others worked from accommodation houses, essentially hotels that rented rooms by the hour. And then there were the brothels, ranging from filthy cellars in the East End to elegantly furnished houses in the West End, where politicians and aristocrats visited. The Haymarket and the Strand were notorious for prostitution. So were the areas around the docks, the theaters, the parks after dark. Respectable women knew to avoid these places, but respectable men visited them constantly. Historians still argue whether Victorian prostitution was primarily driven by male demand or female economic desperation. Though really, it was both, each reinforcing the other in a vicious cycle. What's undeniable is the hypocrisy. The same society that idealized female purity and sexual innocence created the conditions that pushed thousands of women into sex work, then condemned them for it. Middle-class moralists wrote endless tracts about rescuing fallen women, but rarely addressed the economic realities that created the problem. And the police? They mostly looked the other way. Prostitution wasn't technically illegal, though soliciting, brothel keeping, and various related activities were. Enforcement was sporadic and often corrupt. Police could be bribed or could demand sexual favors in exchange for not making arrests. Some women paid protection money to local officers. Others simply accepted harassment as part of the job. You're back on your corner now, trying to stay warm. Another woman nods at you from across the street. Professional courtesy among competitors. You're both just trying to make it through the night. Trying to earn enough to eat, to keep a room, maybe to send a few coins to a child being raised by relatives who think you work in a factory. The shame is crushing. Not because you believe what society says about you, but because you have no choice. Because every other door has closed. Because this is what survival looks like when you're a woman with no money, no family support, no education, and no options. And the worst part? The men who use you go home to wives and daughters. They attend church on Sunday. They lecture about morality and virtue. And they never, ever acknowledge their role in perpetuating the system that keeps you here. But you're not just a victim in this story. You're a survivor. You've learned to negotiate, to spot danger, to protect yourself as best you can. You've formed alliances with other women, sharing information about violent customers and safe places. You found small moments of dignity in an undignified situation. And someday, maybe you'll find a way out. Or maybe you won't. Maybe this is your life now, until disease or violence or exhaustion takes you. That was the reality for tens of thousands of Victorian women. Not the fantasy of the fallen woman rescued by a kind gentleman. Not the morality tale of sin and redemption. Just the grinding, exhausting reality of survival. Let that weight settle for a moment. Feel the cold of those streets, the ache of those feet. Then let it go. You're warm now, safe, far from those corners. And those women, in their own ways, were stronger than anyone gave them credit for. The state decided it had a right to your body. Not just morally, not just socially, legally. You're standing in a police station now, and you're terrified. You haven't committed a crime. Not really. But you're a woman, you're poor, and you've been accused of being a prostitute. That's enough. The Contagious Diseases Acts changed everything. Passed in the 1860s, these laws gave police sweeping powers to detain any woman they suspected of prostitution in certain military towns and ports. No trial, no evidence required, just suspicion. And once detained, you'd be subjected to a forced gynecological examination to check for venereal disease. Here's the well-known fact. The Contagious Diseases Acts were passed in 1864, 1866, and 1869, ostensibly to protect military and naval personnel from syphilis and gonorrhea. But they targeted only women, never the men who were equally responsible for spreading disease. The logic was simple and entirely one-sided. Women were the source of infection. Men were the victims. It was medical policy built on misogyny. You're being led down a hallway now. The walls are institutional green. The floor is cold stone. You've been trying to explain that there's been a mistake, that you're not what they think you are. But it doesn't matter. A policeman saw you walking alone after dark. That was enough to mark you as suspicious. The examination room smells of carbolic acid and something else. Fear, maybe left behind by the women who came before you. There's a table with stirrups. Metal instruments on a tray. A doctor who won't meet your eyes. Here's the eccentric curiosity. The speculum used in these examinations was often called the steel penis by the women subjected to it. The instrument was large, cold, and deliberately designed without regard for comfort. Many women described the examinations as more traumatic than rape. And this was government policy. This was medicine. This was supposedly for the public good. The examination itself is brutal. You're not given privacy to undress. You're not treated with dignity or gentleness. The procedure is painful, humiliating, and completely unnecessary for any legitimate medical purpose. If disease is found, you're locked in a lock hospital, essentially a prison hospital, for up to 3 months or until declared clean. If you refuse examination, you can be imprisoned. There's no escape, no appeal, no justice. Historians still argue whether the Contagious Diseases Acts actually reduced disease rates. Most evidence suggests they didn't. What they did accomplish was giving the state unprecedented control over women's bodies and creating a registry of suspected prostitutes that destroyed reputations and lives. But here's what the acts revealed about Victorian society. Women's bodies were public property. Men's bodies were private and inviolable. A soldier could visit a dozen prostitutes and never face examination or consequences. But a woman could be grabbed off the street on mere suspicion and violated by state authority. The double standard wasn't hidden, it was codified into law, and most people accepted it. After all, soldiers needed protecting. And who cared about the rights of prostitutes? But not everyone stayed silent. A movement began to form. Women, respectable middle-class women, started organizing against the acts. Josephine Butler became the face of this resistance. She was a minister's wife, educated, proper by every Victorian standard, and she was furious. Butler argued that the Contagious Diseases Acts treated women as less than human, that they violated basic principles of liberty and dignity. She published pamphlets, organized meetings, and spoke publicly, which itself was scandalous for a woman of her class. She was called hysterical, unwomanly, immoral. People suggested she must be a prostitute herself to care so much about them. But she didn't stop. Neither did the thousands of women who joined her. Working-class and middle-class women, united by outrage at what their government was doing. They petitioned Parliament. They disrupted political meetings. They refused to be silent. And slowly, painfully, over nearly 2 decades, they won. The acts were suspended in 1883 and finally repealed in 1886. It was one of the first major victories of the women's rights movement in Britain. But the damage had already been done. Thousands of women had been violated. Countless lives had been destroyed by registration as prostitutes. And the message had been sent. Female bodies exist for male use, and the state will enforce that arrangement. You're leaving the police station now. You've been declared clean, at least for today. But you know you could be picked up again tomorrow, next week, anytime. You walk carefully now, avoiding eye contact with police. You dress more conservatively, though it doesn't always help. You live with the knowledge that your body isn't your own, that the state claims ownership over it in ways it would never claim ownership over a man's. And you're angry, so angry. But anger is exhausting when you're also just trying to survive. So you push it down, keep walking, and hope tomorrow will be different. Remember this violation. Remember that laws can sanctify injustice. Remember that sometimes the cruelest violence is done in the name of public health, order, and morality. And remember the women who fought back, who said no, who insisted that their bodies belonged to themselves, even when the entire power structure disagreed. They won. Eventually. It took decades, but they won. Let that thought settle as you drift. Resistance is possible. Change is possible, even against overwhelming power. Even when it seems hopeless, those Victorian women proved it, and their courage echoes forward. To every fight for bodily autonomy, to every person who refuses to be treated as property, to you, here now listening, breathe that in and rest. You're 12 years old. And in Victorian England, that means you're old enough to consent to sex. At least, that's what the law said until 1885. Let that sink in for a moment. 12. The same age when girls today are in middle school, worrying about homework and friendships. In Victorian England, that was the legal age of consent. You're standing in a courtroom now, listening to a case. A man has been accused of raping a 13-year-old girl. But the defense argues she consented, and legally she could. So he walks free. Here's the well-known fact. Until the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, the age of consent in England was just 12 years old. It had been raised from 10 in 1875. Yes, 10, but remained shockingly low by any moral standard. This was an ancient history. This was the height of the Victorian era, the age that supposedly represented the pinnacle of civilization and moral progress. And yet children could be legally violated. The reasoning, such as it was, came from an old common law tradition that defined 12 as the age when a girl could consent to marriage. Never mind that a 12-year-old lacks the physical, emotional, and psychological development to make such decisions. Never mind the obvious power imbalances. The law was the law, and it protected men, not children. Here's the eccentric curiosity. Some Victorian parents actually sold their daughter's virginity to wealthy men. This practice, called maiden tribute, could fetch significant sums, perhaps several pounds, a fortune for a desperate family. Middlemen would broker these transactions, essentially running a market in child rape. It sounds too horrific to be true, but it was real, documented, and widespread enough that reformers considered a crisis. W.T. Stead, a crusading journalist, decided to expose this trade in 1885. He arranged to purchase a 13-year-old girl named Eliza Armstrong from her mother for £5. He did this to prove how easy it was, how casually children could be bought and sold. The resulting article, The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, caused a national scandal. Stead described in explicit detail how young girls were procured, drugged, examined by midwives to verify their virginity, and then delivered to wealthy clients in brothels. He detailed the networks of procuresses, women who specialized in finding and grooming young girls. He exposed the complicity of doctors, midwives, and even some police officers. The public was outraged, not because they didn't know it was happening, many did, but because it was being discussed openly in print where respectable people had to confront it. Historians still argue whether Stead's methods were ethical. He essentially staged a child trafficking scenario himself, traumatizing Eliza Armstrong in the process, even though he never harmed her sexually and returned her safely. But his exposé worked. The scandal created enough pressure that Parliament passed the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, raising the age of consent from 12 to 16. It also criminalized procurement, brothel keeping, and various other activities related to prostitution. Progress, right? Yes, but painfully slow progress purchased at tremendous cost. And even after 1885, enforcement was inconsistent. Poor girls were still vulnerable. Working-class families still faced desperate economic pressures. And the sexual exploitation of children didn't end. It just became slightly more illegal. You're walking through a poor neighborhood now, watching young girls work. Some are servants in wealthy homes, subject to whatever the master or his sons decide to do. Some are factory workers, earning pennies and vulnerable to foremen who demand sexual favors. Some are on the streets, already trapped in prostitution before they've reached adulthood. The law now says they can't consent, but the law doesn't protect them. Not really, because protection requires resources, enforcement, and a society that values poor children's safety as much as it values its own moral reputation. Victorian England was more interested in the latter. They wanted to believe they were civilized, progressive, moral. They wanted to think of their empire as a force for good in the world. But they built that empire on the backs of people they deemed disposable, including children. The same society that idealized childhood innocence through literature. Think of all those Victorian children's books, the sentimental portraits of angelic children, simultaneously allowed real children to be bought, sold, and abused. The contradiction didn't seem to bother most people, or maybe they just didn't think about it. It's easier not to think about uncomfortable truths. Easier to focus on the ideal rather than the reality. Easier to believe the pretty stories than to confront the ugly facts. But the children knew the truth. Every girl who was sold, every boy who was abused, yes, boys too, though they're even more invisible in the historical record. Every young person who learned too early that their body could be taken, used, discarded. They knew, and some of them survived, somehow, carried that trauma through their lives, became adults who never quite escaped what was done to them. You're not 12 anymore. You're here, now, safe in your own time. But take a moment to honor those children, the ones whose names we don't know, the ones who didn't have journalists to expose their suffering, the ones who simply endured. And remember that progress isn't inevitable. Rights aren't natural. Every protection we take for granted was fought for, often against fierce resistance. Someone had to demand that 12-year-olds weren't old enough to consent. Someone had to insist that children deserve protection, even poor children, even girls. Someone had to make it a scandal instead of just accepting it as the way things were. And even now, the fight isn't finished. Exploitation still exists. Children are still vulnerable. The forms change, the technologies evolve, but the fundamental cruelty persists. So rest now. Let your mind settle. But carry forward the memory of those Victorian children and the knowledge that silence protects abusers, that speaking up matters, that every generation has to choose whether to confront injustice or look away. Those Victorian reformers chose to look, to see, to act, however imperfectly. And because of them, something changed. Not everything, not enough, but something. Let that be enough for tonight. You're a man who loves men. And in Victorian England, that makes you a criminal. Not just socially unacceptable, not just morally condemned, actually, legally, punishably criminal. You're standing in a London pub, careful about how long you let your gaze linger. You've learned to read signals, a certain look, a particular handkerchief color, coded phrases that might mean someone shares your inclinations, or might mean nothing at all. It's a dangerous game, because getting it wrong could destroy your entire life. Here's the well-known fact. The Labouchere Amendment of 1885, passed as part of the same Criminal Law Amendment Act that raised the age of consent, made gross indecency between men illegal, even in private. Before this, only sodomy was specifically criminalized. Now, any sexual contact between men, or even perceived sexual behavior, could result in imprisonment with hard labor. The maximum sentence was 2 years. But the social death sentence was permanent. The law didn't mention women, not because lesbian relationships were accepted, but because legislators couldn't bring themselves to acknowledge they existed. Queen Victoria herself allegedly refused to believe women could love each other sexually, so female homosexuality remained legally invisible. But male homosexuality? That had to be stamped out. You're walking home now, down streets you know well. You pass a policeman and your heart rate increases. Not because you've done anything wrong tonight, but because you exist in a state of permanent vulnerability. Here's the eccentric curiosity. Victorian men who loved men developed elaborate codes and meeting places. Molly houses had existed since the 18th century. Private homes or taverns where men could gather. Public bathhouses, certain parks after dark. Even public toilets became known cruising grounds. The Cleveland Street scandal of 1889 exposed a male brothel in London where telegraph boys serviced aristocratic clients, revealing networks that stretched into the highest levels of society. The irony was thick. The same society that celebrated intense male friendships, that encouraged men to form deep emotional bonds in boys' schools and military regiments, that praised classical Greek culture with its explicit homoeroticism. That same society criminalized sexual expression of those feelings. Men could write passionate letters to each other. They could share beds, common practice in an era when accommodations were scarce. They could express profound love and devotion, but cross some invisible line into physical intimacy, and you became a criminal. Where was that line? Nobody quite knew. And that ambiguity was the point. It kept everyone afraid, everyone careful. Historians still argue whether many Victorian same-sex relationships remained platonic out of genuine lack of sexual interest, or whether the historical record simply doesn't reveal what happened in private, whether letters were destroyed, diaries censored, evidence carefully erased. What's certain is that men who loved men existed in every Victorian community. They were doctors, teachers, artists, laborers, aristocrats, soldiers. They were married with children, maintaining respectable facades. Or they were bachelors, arousing suspicion by remaining single. Either way, they lived with constant fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of blackmail, which was rampant, as men with secrets were easy targets. Fear of arrest, trial, imprisonment. Fear of losing everything: career, reputation, family, freedom. Some men were caught, arrested in parks or bathhouses or private rooms raided by police. The trials were sensational, reported in newspapers with barely concealed prurience. The accused were destroyed publicly, their names dragged through the press. Their families disowned them. Their friends abandoned them. And after imprisonment, they emerged to find themselves permanently marked, unemployable, socially dead. Some men fled to Europe, Paris, Berlin, Italy, where enforcement was less strict or different codes applied. Others remained in England, living carefully, finding moments of connection in the shadows. You're in your room now, alone. You have a photograph of another man on your desk, your friend. You tell anyone who asks. Nobody questions it. Male friendship is encouraged, after all, but you know what it really means. You know what you feel when you look at his face, and you know you can never say it out loud. Not to him, perhaps not even to yourself in your most private thoughts, because acknowledging desire makes it real, and real desire is dangerous. So you translate it into something else: admiration, respect, brotherhood, safe words for unsafe feelings. And maybe that's enough. Maybe just knowing he exists, that you can see him regularly, write to him, be near him. Maybe that's as close to happiness as you're allowed. Or maybe it's torture. This constant proximity without touch. This love that can't be named. This life lived half in shadow. Some men found ways to be happy anyway. They built lives with companions, households with servants who were really partners. They found communities, discrete networks of men who understood. They traveled together, lived together, grew old together. And if society whispered, well, let them whisper. As long as nothing was proven, nothing was said explicitly, they could exist. Precarious, yes. Always vulnerable, yes. But existing nonetheless. And that was its own kind of victory. You're drifting now between that Victorian room and this present moment, thinking about how far things have changed, how recently they changed, how fragile those changes still are. The Victorian era feels distant, but its laws persisted well into the 20th century. Men were still being imprisoned for loving each other within living memory. The shadows those laws cast are long, but they're shadows, not solid walls anymore. And the men who survived that era, who loved despite everything, they deserve to be remembered, not as criminals, not as scandals, but as people who loved, who found ways to be human in an inhuman system, who refused to disappear completely, even when society demanded it. Let that thought settle. Rest easy. You're safe here. You're a woman who loves women, and nobody talks about it. Not because it's illegal, though it easily could be, but because Victorian society refused to believe you existed. You're sitting in a parlor with your dearest friend. Your hands are clasped together. Your heads are bent close as you read poetry aloud. To anyone watching, this is perfectly innocent. Female friendship is not just accepted, it's celebrated, encouraged, idealized. Women are expected to form intense emotional bonds with each other. And that expectation creates a space where love can hide in plain sight. Here's the well-known fact. Victorian women often engaged in what historians call romantic friendships, relationships characterized by passionate correspondence, physical affection, cohabitation, and lifelong devotion. These relationships were socially acceptable as long as they remained within the bounds of proper feminine behavior, which paradoxically allowed much more physical and emotional intimacy than male friendships could. Women could sleep in the same bed, and nobody questioned it. They could kiss, embrace, declare eternal love in letters. They could live together for decades as lifelong companions. And society nodded approvingly at this beautiful example of feminine devotion, because women weren't supposed to have sexual desire. So how could their relationships be sexual? The logic was circular and convenient. It allowed lesbian relationships to exist as long as nobody named them as such. You're reading a letter now, one you've read dozens of times. It's from her, written last month when she was visiting family. My darling, it begins. I count the hours until I'm back in your arms. She writes about missing your touch, your voice, your presence beside her at night. She signs it, your devoted wife, even though neither of you will ever legally marry. Here's the eccentric curiosity. The ladies of Llangollen, Eleanor Butler and Sarah Ponsonby, eloped together in 1778 and lived as a couple in Wales for over 50 years. They were celebrated as models of romantic friendship, visited by literary figures and aristocrats, and their relationship was seen as admirably chaste and devoted. Whether they had a sexual relationship is debated by historians, but their own writings suggest profound romantic and possibly erotic love. Victorian society could accommodate such relationships as long as everyone maintained plausible deniability. Don't call it sexual. Don't acknowledge physical desire. Keep it wrapped in a language of friendship, devotion, and feminine sentiment. And you could build an entire life with another woman. Some women did exactly that. They pooled resources and established households together. They raised each other's children from previous marriages. They traveled, wrote, created art together. They nursed each other through illness and mourned each other's deaths as widows mourn spouses. And society called them spinsters, companions, devoted friends. Never lovers, never wives. Those words were forbidden. Historians still argue whether Victorian women in romantic friendships understood their relationships as sexual or romantic in a modern sense, or whether they genuinely conceptualized them as intensely passionate but non-sexual bonds, and whether that distinction even matters. What's clear is that many women loved women. Some may have had physical relationships. Others may not have, either from lack of knowledge, religious conviction, or genuine asexuality. But the emotional reality was love. Deep, committed, life-shaping love. You're walking through a garden now with her. Your arms are linked, perfectly acceptable for female friends. She's telling you about her day, and you're barely listening to the words. You're just watching her face, the way afternoon light catches in her hair. You want to kiss her. You have kissed her in private in your shared bedroom. But you'd never call it that. You'd never think of yourself as what? There isn't even a word for it. Sapphist exists, borrowed from the ancient Greek poet Sappho. But it's a word for medical texts and pornography, not something respectable women use. So you don't name what you are. You just live it. And that namelessness is both protection and prison. Protection because what has no name can't be prosecuted or pathologized. Prison because what has no name can't be fully claimed or celebrated. You exist in a liminal space. Visible but invisible. Known but unacknowledged. Real but impossible. Some women found this arrangement perfectly satisfactory. They didn't want to think of themselves as sexual beings anyway. Victorian propriety had taught them that good women weren't sexual. So a relationship built on emotional intimacy, domestic partnership, and romantic devotion felt pure, untainted by the messiness of male sexuality. Other women chafed against the silence. They wanted words for what they felt. They wanted recognition, not just tolerance through willful ignorance. But those words wouldn't come for decades, and recognition would take even longer. You're lying in bed now, in the dark. She's beside you, breathing softly in sleep. Her hand rests in yours beneath the covers. Tomorrow you'll wake up and be companions again. You'll maintain the careful performance of propriety. But here, In this darkness, you can admit the truth to yourself. You love her, not as a friend, though she is your friend, not as a sister, though you're devoted to her. You love her the way poets write about, the way songs celebrate. You love her wholly, completely, in ways that would scandalize society if they knew. But they don't know. They can't see what they refuse to believe exists. And so you're safe, hidden in plain sight, living a love that dares not speak its name. Not because the law forbids it, but because the language doesn't exist. Remember those gloved hands from earlier, the half-open doors, the candlelight reflections? That's where women like you lived. In the spaces between, in the silences, in the words that meant more than they said. And somehow, against all odds, love survived there. Flourished even, in the cracks of an oppressive system, in the blind spots of surveillance, in the assumptions that made you invisible. You were there all along, loving, living, existing, just waiting for the world to finally see you. Let that be your gentle rest now. You're seen, you're known, and you're not alone. Contraception was criminal, but everyone was using it anyway. You're a married woman now, 28 years old, and you already have 5 children. 5 pregnancies in 8 years of marriage. Your body is exhausted. Your doctor has warned that another pregnancy might kill you. But your husband still has his rights. And the law says you have no right to prevent conception. So you're about to break the law. Here's the well-known fact. The sale and distribution of contraceptive information and devices was effectively criminalized in Britain through various obscenity laws, particularly after the 1877 trial of Charles Bradlaugh and Annie Besant for publishing a pamphlet about birth control. They were convicted of obscenity, though the verdict was later overturned on a technicality. The message was clear: talking about preventing pregnancy was dangerous. But people talked anyway. And more importantly, they acted. You're meeting a woman in a tea shop this afternoon. Not a friend, exactly. A friend of a friend. She knows things, sells things. You're terrified someone will see you, will know what you're discussing. But you're more terrified of another pregnancy. She slides a small package across the table, wrapped in brown paper. Inside are sponges and a bottle of liquid, vinegar mixed with something else she won't name. She explains quietly how to use them, when to insert the sponge, how to soak it first, how to remove it afterward. It's awkward, uncomfortable, and deeply humiliating to discuss, but might save your life. Here's the eccentric curiosity. Victorian contraceptive methods were surprisingly varied and inventive. Women used sponges soaked in vinegar, quinine, or even brandy. They douched with solutions ranging from lemon juice to carbolic acid. Dangerous, but desperation breeds creativity. Pessaries made of cocoa butter containing spermicidal substances were available. And condoms existed, made from animal intestines or, by the late Victorian era, vulcanized rubber. Condoms were marketed as protection against disease, not pregnancy. That made them slightly more acceptable. But everyone knew their dual purpose. Men could buy them from barbers, certain chemists, or through discreet mail-order catalogs. Women's options were more limited and required more insider knowledge. The underground network was extensive. Midwives who attended births often also provided contraceptive advice. Certain pharmacists would sell supplies if you knew how to ask. Street vendors in working-class neighborhoods sold sponges and syringes. And pamphlets circulated, printed cheaply, distributed hand-to-hand, offering practical information that medical authorities refused to provide. The most famous was Fruits of Philosophy by Charles Knowlton, an American physician. The 1877 trial of Bradlaugh and Besant for distributing it in Britain only increased demand. Within months, hundreds of thousands of copies circulated. Historians still argue whether the declining birth rate in late Victorian England, families began having fewer children after 1870, was primarily due to contraception, delayed marriage, abstinence, or other factors. But contraceptive use clearly increased dramatically, despite the legal risks. You're home now, alone in your bedroom. The package is hidden in your wardrobe, behind your winter shawls where your husband won't look. Tonight, before he comes to bed, you'll use what you've learned. The process is awkward, clinical, unromantic, but it's yours. A small piece of control over your own body. A chance to survive. The irony isn't lost on you. The same society that demands you be a dutiful wife also criminalizes the tools that would let you survive that duty. You're supposed to submit to your husband, but you're also supposed to maintain your health, raise your existing children, manage your household. And if constant pregnancy makes all that impossible, well, that's your problem to solve quietly. So you solve it, like thousands of other women, in secret, in shame, but with determination. Some women were less fortunate. They couldn't access contraception, or it failed. And then they faced another impossible choice. But that's a story for later. For now, you're just grateful to have this option. However imperfect, however illegal, however humiliating, it's better than the alternative. Your friend, the one who connected you with the woman in the tea shop, she has 3 children and no more. She's been using sponges for 5 years. Her husband doesn't know, or pretends not to know, and she's healthier, happier, more able to care for the children she has. That's all you want. Not to avoid motherhood entirely. You love your children. Just to space out pregnancies. To give your body time to recover. To have some say in the shape of your own life. Is that really so radical? Victorian moralists thought so. They argued that contraception would destroy marriage, encourage promiscuity, separate sex from its natural purpose. They claimed women who used it were selfish, unwomanly, shirking their duty. Religious authorities condemned it as interfering with God's plan. Medical authorities called it dangerous, which was sometimes true, given the harsh chemicals women used. But none of these authorities offered solutions. None of them acknowledged that constant pregnancy killed women, that poverty made large families catastrophic, that women's bodies weren't infinite resources to be depleted. So women took matters into their own hands. Literally, and slowly, quietly, family sizes began to shrink. Not because women loved children less, but because they loved themselves and their existing children enough to survive. Remember that feeling of control, however small. That moment of agency in a system designed to deny it. That's what contraception represented. Not immorality, not selfishness, just the basic human desire to have some say in what happens to your own body. The Victorians couldn't acknowledge that openly, but in their private bedrooms, in whispered conversations, in underground networks of knowledge sharing, they acknowledged it anyway, and changed the course of history. One sponge, one pamphlet, one carefully guarded secret at a time. Let that quiet revolution soothe you now. Progress doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it happens in silence, in shadows, in the spaces authorities can't quite police. And those small acts of resistance accumulate. Until one day, what was criminal becomes common. What was shameful becomes sensible. What was hidden becomes accepted. That day was still decades away for Victorian women, but they were building toward it. One brave, illegal choice at a time. Rest easy. Contraception failed. Or maybe you never had access to it in the first place. And now you're pregnant again. And you can't be. You simply can't. You're standing in a narrow alley in the East End, waiting. The address was passed to you by someone who knew someone. No names were exchanged. Just a location and a time. You knock on a nondescript door. A woman answers, middle-aged, unremarkable, her expression neutral. She quotes you a price. You have the money. Barely. You've been saving, hiding coins from the household budget. She lets you in. Here's the well-known fact. Abortion was illegal in Victorian England under the Offences Against the Person Act of 1861, which made it a felony punishable by life imprisonment. But the law was rarely enforced against women seeking abortions. Prosecutors focused on providers instead, and the practice remained widespread, operating through a vast underground network of herbalists, midwives, and back-alley practitioners. Abortion was called many things. Taking the trade, bringing on the courses, removing an obstruction, restoring regularity. The euphemisms protected everyone. They allowed advertisements in newspapers that claimed to treat female irregularities, without explicitly mentioning pregnancy. Pills promised to restore monthly cycles. Potions claimed to remove blockages. Everyone understood what these really meant. The woman leads you to a back room. It's cleaner than you expected, at least. A bed with sheets. A basin of water. Instruments that look vaguely medical. She's done this before, hundreds of times, probably. She explains the procedure quickly, matter-of-factly. It will hurt. You might bleed heavily. If fever develops, you'll need to see a doctor and lie about what happened. Say you miscarried naturally. Never mention her name. Here's the eccentric curiosity. Victorian abortionists were often women, many of them former nurses or midwives. Some were called angel makers, a term that also applied to baby farmers who disposed of unwanted infants. The most famous was Madame Restel in New York, but London had dozens of similar practitioners. They advertised openly in newspapers, using coded language, and operated for years before occasional prosecutions. The methods varied. Herbal preparations, pennyroyal, tansy, rue, were taken as teas or tinctures. Some worked through toxicity, essentially poisoning the body until it expelled the pregnancy. Others were simply placebos that did nothing. Mechanical intervention was more reliable but more dangerous. Probes inserted through the cervix to rupture membranes. Syringes to inject irritating solutions. Dilation and manual removal. All of it painful. All of it risky. All of it better than the alternative in your calculation. You lie back on the bed. The woman tells you to breathe deeply. And then it begins. The pain is extraordinary. Sharp, cramping, relentless. You bite down a leather strap she's given you and try not to scream. It's over in minutes, though it feels like hours. She gives you rags to absorb the bleeding and instructs you to rest before leaving. You pay her the remaining coins. She burns the rags in her fireplace while you watch. Evidence destroyed. Historians still argue whether the decline in family size in late Victorian England was more attributable to contraception or abortion. Probably both, used in combination as women desperately tried to control their fertility with whatever tools they could access. What's certain is that thousands of women did this. Poor women, mostly, but also middle-class women who couldn't afford another mouth to feed or another pregnancy. Single women who faced social destruction if they bore an illegitimate child. Married women whose husbands were violent or absent. Women whose health couldn't survive another birth. Women who simply decided no. Some died from infections, hemorrhage, or botched procedures. Their deaths were recorded as miscarriages or mysterious fevers. Their families grieved without understanding what had really happened. And the practitioners who killed them through incompetence or dirty instruments usually faced no consequences. But many women survived. They returned to their lives, their secrets kept. They never spoke of it, not even to close friends. The shame was too great, the legal risk too severe. So they carried it silently. You're walking home now, moving slowly, one hand pressed to your abdomen. You're bleeding through the rags already. Tomorrow you'll tell your family you're feeling unwell, monthly troubles. In a few days, if all goes well, you'll recover. And no one will ever know. Your husband won't know that the child he might have wanted never came to be. Your existing children won't know they almost had another sibling. Your neighbors won't know why you look pale and move carefully for a week. The secret will die with you, like thousands of other secrets carried by thousands of other women. The Victorian obsession with female purity created this underground. By making sex shameful and pregnancy outside marriage catastrophic, they ensured women would seek desperate solutions. By criminalizing abortion while offering no support for unwanted children, they guaranteed dangerous back-alley procedures. By denying women any control over their reproduction, they forced women to seize control however they could. The system was cruel, but women were resourceful, and survival sometimes requires breaking unjust laws. You're home now, lying in your own bed. The worst of the pain is subsiding. You're alive. You're going to be all right. And you've made a choice, however terrible, however constrained your options were. You've claimed agency over your own body, your own future. The Victorians would call you a murderess. The church would call you a sinner. The law would call you a criminal. But you're none of those things. You're just a woman trying to survive in a world that gives you impossible choices. And you're not alone. You never were. In every Victorian city, in every town and village, women were making this same choice. Quietly, desperately, necessarily, and slowly, painfully the tide would turn. Laws would change. Medicine would improve. Women would gain more control. But that's still far in the future. For now, just rest. Let your body heal. Let the pain fade. You survived. That's enough. Pornography thrived in the shadows. And it was everywhere. You're a respectable Victorian gentleman, walking down Holywell Street. This narrow lane near the Strand has a reputation. The shop windows display innocent-looking books and prints during daylight hours. But you know what's really inside? Everyone knows. You step into one of these establishments, and the shopkeeper recognizes the look. He disappears into the back room and returns with materials kept hidden. Books with plain brown covers. Photographs wrapped in tissue paper. Prints that would never be displayed openly. You browse, pretending casualness, then make your selection and pay. The transaction is quick, discreet. You leave with your purchase hidden in your coat. Here's the well-known fact. The Obscene Publications Act of 1857 gave authorities power to seize and destroy materials deemed obscene, defining obscenity as anything that could deprave and corrupt those whose minds are open to such immoral influences. But enforcement was inconsistent, and the demand for erotic material was so high that the underground market flourished despite periodic crackdowns. Holywell Street was demolished in the 1900s specifically to eliminate this red light district of pornography. But while it existed, it was the epicenter of Britain's erotic publishing industry. Hundreds of shops operated there, some legitimate booksellers with secret back rooms, others entirely devoted to the underground trade. They sold everything. French postcards showing nude women in classical poses. Illustrated novels with explicit sexual content. Flagellation literature. The Victorians were particularly obsessed with spanking. Photographs that pushed every boundary of the era's technology. Here's the eccentric curiosity. The Pearl was a pornographic magazine published monthly in London from 1879 to 1880, featuring erotic stories, poems, and songs. It cost 1 shilling and circulated among wealthy men despite being completely illegal. After 18 issues, the publishers were prosecuted and it ceased publication, but copies circulated for decades, and it's now considered a fascinating document of Victorian sexual attitudes. The content ranged from mildly titillating to shockingly explicit. Stories about seducing servants, affairs with married women, group encounters. Detailed descriptions of anatomy and acts that polite society pretended didn't exist. Humor, poetry, even philosophical musings, all wrapped around explicit sexual content. Who bought this material? Not just the working classes or the dissolute. Aristocrats, politicians, doctors, clergy, men from every level of society. They kept private collections, hidden in locked drawers in private libraries. Some collections were elaborate, carefully curated over decades. Others were hastily acquired and quickly destroyed when fear of discovery arose. Historians still argue whether Victorian pornography reveals genuine sexual practices and desires of the era, or whether it represents pure fantasy that bore little relation to what people actually did in their bedrooms. The truth is probably somewhere between. Some of it was fantasy, exotic scenarios, impossible stamina, idealized bodies. But some reflected real desires, real practices, real aspects of Victorian sexuality that couldn't be discussed openly. The homosexual content, for instance. The interracial fantasies that revealed colonial obsessions. The power dynamics that mirrored real social hierarchies. All of it hidden, but all of it circulating. You're home now, in your private study. The door is locked. You've opened your purchase, a volume called something innocuous on the spine, but filled with explicit content. The prose is often purple, overwrought. Her heaving bosom, his manly vigor, phrases that seem absurd now, but thrilled Victorian readers. The illustrations are carefully rendered. Some are artistic, almost beautiful. Others are crude, mechanical, focused entirely on anatomy. You read for a while, then hide the book behind your respectable volumes. Tomorrow you'll return to being a proper gentleman. But tonight, in this private moment, you've indulged desires that can't exist in daylight. And you're not alone. Across London, across England, thousands of men are doing the same thing. Reading by candlelight, looking at photographs purchased discreetly, imagining scenarios they'd never admit to wanting. The Victorian paradox in miniature. Absolute public propriety maintained by private indulgence. The more they repressed sexuality in public discourse, the more elaborate the underground became. The stricter the rules, the more creative the violations. And the pornographers knew it. They understood their market intimately. They knew what sold. Forbidden power dynamics, taboo relationships, elaborate scenarios of seduction and conquest. They published from London, but often claimed French or Belgian origins. Continental pornography could be dismissed as foreign corruption rather than homegrown English vice. Some of the most famous Victorian pornographic novels, Fanny Hill, The Lustful Turk, The Sins of the Cities of the Plain, circulated for decades in expensive private editions that only wealthy collectors could afford. But cheaper editions, printed on poor paper with crude illustrations, reached working-class readers too. Pornography was one of the few things that crossed class boundaries. Rich and poor, educated and illiterate, urban and rural, everyone wanted it. Everyone consumed it. Everyone pretended they didn't. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? Victorian pornography was similarly paradoxical, simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, widely known yet officially non-existent. You could walk down Holywell Street and see the shops. You could recognize other customers making the same discreet purchases. But you'd never mention it, never acknowledge what everyone knew. And that collective denial allowed the whole system to function. The authorities occasionally raided a shop, seized some materials, made a public show of destroying obscenity. But new shops opened immediately. New publishers filled the gap. The demand was inexhaustible. Let yourself drift now, thinking about all those contradictions. The society that idealized purity while producing industrial quantities of pornography. The people who publicly condemned vice while privately consuming it. The laws that criminalized what half the population was secretly doing. It would be funny if it weren't so exhausting. All that energy spent on denial. All that hypocrisy maintained. All those secrets kept. But maybe that's just human nature. The gap between who we claim to be and who we actually are. The Victorians just made that gap wider and more elaborate than most eras. They turned hypocrisy into an art form. And pornography thrived in the space between. Rest now. You're safe here. No judgments. No hypocrisy. Just honesty about what the Victorians were really like. Complicated, contradictory, and so very human. Virginity was everything. Not just desirable. Not just preferred. Everything. You're a young woman, 16 years old, being prepared for your debut into society. Your mother has taken you aside for what she calls an important conversation. But she's not telling you about sex. She's telling you about reputation. Your value, she explains, lies in your purity. A single rumor, a whispered suspicion, even being alone with a man for 5 minutes. Any of these could destroy you. And destruction means no marriage. No marriage means no future. No security, no home, no children, no place in respectable society. Your entire life depends on a piece of tissue inside your body that you're not supposed to acknowledge exists. Here's the well-known fact. The Victorian cult of female purity reached its peak in the mid to late 19th century, transforming virginity from a religious virtue into a social obsession. Medical texts claimed that loss of virginity fundamentally changed a woman's character, making her coarse, unfeminine, and morally compromised. Some doctors even claimed they could tell if a woman was a virgin by examining her eyes or posture. This was pseudoscience, of course, but it was widely believed pseudoscience, and it gave enormous power to anyone who could threaten a woman's reputation. Your mother is explaining the rules now. Never be alone with a man, even your fiancé. Always travel with a chaperone. Never allow your hand to be held too long. Never let a kiss linger. Never, ever allow more than that. One mistake and you're ruined. Here's the eccentric curiosity. Some Victorian mothers were so invested in preserving their daughter's ignorance that they wouldn't explain menstruation. Girls experienced their first periods with no warning, sometimes believing they were dying or had contracted a disease. The shock was considered preferable to giving them knowledge that might lead to impure thoughts. Ignorance was protection, supposedly. Knowledge was corruption. So you entered womanhood knowing almost nothing about your own body. You learned to fear it instead of understand it. You learned that your body was both your greatest asset and your greatest vulnerability. And you learned that men could not be trusted, not because they were evil, though some were, but because even good men, respectable men, would take advantage if given the opportunity. This was presented as natural, inevitable. Men had urges they couldn't control. Women had to control them by never presenting temptation. If something happened, it was always the woman's fault. She was in the wrong place, wore the wrong thing, said the wrong words. Encourage him somehow. The logic was circular and suffocating. You had to be desirable enough to attract a husband, but never so desirable that you tempted men improperly. You had to be innocent enough to be pure, but educated enough to manage a household. You had to know nothing about sex before marriage, but somehow become an accomplished wife overnight. The contradictions were impossible to navigate, and that was the point. Keeping women off balance, uncertain, dependent on male protection and approval. Historians still argue whether the Victorian virginity cult was primarily about controlling female sexuality or about ensuring paternity in an era before genetic testing. Men wanted to be certain their heirs were biologically theirs. Probably both, and probably also about class anxiety. Middle-class families used female purity to distinguish themselves from the immoral working classes. It became a marker of status, respectability, worthiness. Poor women who couldn't afford chaperones or maintain constant surveillance were automatically suspect, which meant they were vulnerable to exploitation with little recourse. You're at a ball now, your first real social event. Your dance card is filling up, but you're hyper-aware of every interaction. Is your dress cut too low? It's fashionable, your mother approved it, but that man keeps staring. When you dance, you maintain the proper distance, at least 6 inches between you and your partner. When you speak, you keep your eyes modestly downcast, but not too much or you seem sly. When you laugh, you keep it soft and controlled, never boisterous. Every moment is a performance. Every action is calculated. One wrong move and whispers begin. And once whispers begin, they never stop. Your best friend from childhood isn't here tonight. She was seen riding alone in a carriage with a man last month. Just riding. Nothing happened. But it doesn't matter what actually happened. It matters what people might think happened. So she's been sent to stay with relatives in the countryside until the scandal dies down. If it dies down, she might never return to London society. Her marriage prospects are gone. Her future, shrunk to spinsterhood or an obscure marriage to someone desperate or indifferent to reputation. All because of a carriage ride. You remember this, and you're careful. So very careful. But here's the cruelty. Some women did everything right and still ended up ruined. Sexual assault victims were blamed for their own violation. Women whose reputations were maliciously slandered had no legal recourse. And sometimes, despite all precautions, accidents happened. A chaperone fell ill. A brother brought a friend home unexpectedly. Circumstances created unwanted proximity. The system was designed so that women could never be safe, could never relax, could never fully trust their own judgment or circumstances, because the consequences of failure were catastrophic. And yet, virginity itself was never quite enough. You also had to seem virginal, modest, ignorant, shocked by any mention of indelicacy. You had to perform innocence even if you weren't quite innocent. And many women did exactly that. They learned the performance so well that their husbands never suspected they'd gained sexual knowledge through assault, abuse, or even curiosity and experimentation. The wedding night fiction of complete ignorance was maintained through skilled acting. Let that exhaustion settle over you now. The constant vigilance, the perpetual performance, the weight of knowing your entire future depends on your body remaining in a particular state. A state you're not supposed to understand. A state everyone is watching to verify. A state that, once lost, can never be regained. The Victorians built an entire social structure on this foundation, and it crushed countless women beneath it. But some survived. Some even found ways to thrive. And slowly, painfully, the system began to crack. But that's ahead. For now, just rest. You don't have to perform for anyone here. You don't have to guard your reputation. You're safe. Male sexuality was supposed to be savage, uncontrollable, a beast that civilization barely kept in check. You're a young man now, hearing this message from every direction. Your father, when he bothers to discuss such things, speaks vaguely about natural urges. Your schoolmasters warn about temptation and self-control. Medical pamphlets describe male desire as a powerful force that must be properly channeled. And the subtext is always the same. You're an animal. A civilized animal, hopefully, but an animal nonetheless. Here's the well-known fact. Victorian medical and moral literature portrayed male sexuality as inherently aggressive and difficult to control. The prevailing theory held that men possess strong sexual drives by nature, necessary for procreation, while women ideally possessed none. This justified the sexual double standard. Men's indiscretions were regrettable but understandable, while women's were unforgivable. You were expected to sow wild oats. Not encouraged exactly, but it was understood that young men would visit prostitutes, have affairs, experiment sexually before marriage. These experiences didn't diminish your value as a husband. They might even enhance it. You'd be experienced, knowledgeable, able to guide your innocent bride. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Women had to remain virgins or be ruined. Men were expected to gain experience somehow. With whom? The women whose ruin made them available, of course. The logic ate itself, but nobody seemed to notice or care. Here's the eccentric curiosity. Some Victorian advice manuals recommended that men marry slightly older women, widows or women in their late 20s, specifically because these women would have lower sexual desire and thus wouldn't tax a husband's self-control. A man with strong passions needed a cool, restrained wife to balance him, the theory went. This was considered scientific wisdom. You're in university now, surrounded by other young men. The conversations in your dormitory after dark would shock your mother. Boasting about conquests, real or imagined. Comparing notes on the best brothels. Sharing pornography that circulates through your social circle. Making crude jokes that everyone laughs at because not laughing would mark you as prudish or strange. You're learning masculinity from these interactions. Learning that sexual success defines your worth among peers. Learning that women exist in categories, pure ones to marry, impure ones to use. Learning that desire is shameful, but also evidence of your virility. The contradictions are dizzying. You're supposed to control yourself around respectable women, but you're also supposed to be sexually aggressive, dominant, experienced. You're supposed to respect your future wife's innocence. But you're also supposed to initiate her into sexual knowledge on your wedding night. You're supposed to be rational, civilized, better than your base urges. But those urges are also what make you a man. Historians still argue whether Victorian men genuinely believed this narrative about their own uncontrollable sexuality, or whether it was a convenient fiction that excused bad behavior while maintaining social hierarchies. Probably some believed it. Probably others used it cynically. And probably most fell somewhere in between, partly convinced, partly performing, always navigating the contradictions. The medical establishment reinforced these ideas constantly. Doctors warned that excessive sexual activity would drain a man's vital energy, but also that suppressing sexuality entirely would cause nervous disorders. The solution? Marriage to a proper woman and moderate sexual expression within that marriage. With emphasis on moderate. Too much sex, even in marriage, was considered dangerous. It could weaken you physically and mentally. It could make you effeminate. It could drain the vital fluids necessary for success in business and life. So you needed sex, but not too much sex. You needed to express your masculine urges, but also control them. You needed to be both beast and gentleman, savage and civilized, natural and restrained. You're walking through a London street at night now. A woman approaches, clearly a prostitute. Your friends nudge you, encourage you, laugh. You're torn. Part of you wants to prove your masculinity to them. Part of you is terrified of disease, of shame, of your own inexperience showing. Part of you feels sorry for her, though you'd never admit it. You make an excuse and keep walking. Your friends mock you gently, but they'll forget by tomorrow. And you're relieved, because despite everything you've been told about your savage male nature, you don't actually feel savage. You feel confused, scared, uncertain about what's expected and whether you can meet those expectations. The gap between the myth of masculine sexuality and your actual experience is enormous. But there's no space to discuss that gap. No language for saying, I don't feel like a beast. No permission to admit vulnerability or uncertainty. So you perform the role. You laugh at the crude jokes. You pretend to understand more than you do. You maintain the facade of easy, uncomplicated masculine desire. And you hope that marriage will somehow make everything clearer. That your wedding night will be the transformative moment where you become the man you're supposed to be. Experienced, confident, in control of both yourself and your wife. But you suspect it won't be that simple. You suspect your wife will be as confused and frightened as you are. And you have no idea how to bridge that gap. No one taught you about tenderness. Only about urges. No one taught you about communication. Only about dominance. No one taught you that sex could be mutual, negotiated, gentle. Only that it was your right and her duty. So you'll likely fumble through it. Hurt her without meaning to. Disappoint yourself. And never discuss it with anyone. Because men don't discuss such things. Men are supposed to know instinctively. To be naturally skilled at something, they're also supposed to naturally struggle to control. The contradiction would be funny if it wasn't so damaging. To everyone involved, let that weight settle. The burden of impossible expectations. The loneliness of performing masculinity without support or honesty. The damage done to women by men who were themselves damaged by the system. Victorian sexuality harmed everyone. Women more obviously and severely. But men too in different ways. Twisted into shapes that served neither their happiness nor their partners. Taught to be beasts and then punished for being beastly. Taught to dominate and then blamed when domination created misery. It's not an excuse, just an explanation. Another facet of a system that crushed humanity in service of rigid, impossible ideals. Rest now. You don't have to perform anything. You don't have to be savage or civilized. Just human. Complicated, uncertain, learning. That's enough. That's always been enough. Masturbation would kill you. At least, that's what they said. You're a teenage boy, and you've just discovered something extraordinary about your own body. Something that feels intensely pleasurable. Something you could do alone, in private. Something that seems natural and harmless. But then you find a pamphlet, or hear a lecture at school, or overhear adults speaking in hushed, horrified tones, and you learn that what you've been doing will destroy you. Here's the well-known fact. Victorian medical establishment waged an intense campaign against masturbation, which they called self-abuse or the solitary vice. Doctors claimed it caused insanity, blindness, epilepsy, stunted growth, weakness, and early death. Medical texts devoted hundreds of pages to cataloging the supposed dangers and proposing increasingly extreme preventive measures. The panic wasn't new to the Victorian era, but the Victorians perfected it. They industrialized it. They turned anxiety about masturbation into a profitable medical concern. You're reading one of these pamphlets now, and you're terrified. It describes boys who masturbated and ended up in asylums, drooling and insane. Men whose vital fluids were so depleted they became walking skeletons. Young people who went blind or developed epilepsy or simply wasted away. The language is graphic, designed to horrify. And it works. You're convinced you've already damaged yourself irreparably. Every time you feel tired, you think, that's the beginning. Every time you can't focus on your studies, evidence of mental decay. You examine yourself in the mirror, looking for signs of the deterioration you're sure is coming. Here's the eccentric curiosity. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, yes, the cornflakes Kellogg, was obsessed with preventing masturbation. He believed bland food would reduce sexual urges, hence his invention of cornflakes. He also advocated for circumcision without anesthetic for boys caught masturbating, and even more horrific treatments involving carbolic acid for girls. His sanitarium promoted extreme measures to control sexuality in the name of health. The preventive devices were medieval. Spiked rings that would cause pain if the penis became erect during sleep. Straitjackets and restraints for children's hands. Sleeping mittens that prevented access. Alarm systems that would wake parents if a child's hand moved toward their genitals. Some doctors recommended removing the clitoris of girls who masturbated, or applying leeches to the genitals, or blistering agents that would make touching oneself too painful to contemplate. This was medicine. This was science. This was concern for children's well-being. Historians still argue whether the masturbation panic was genuinely believed by medical authorities or whether it was a means of social control disguised as health concern. Probably both, with doctors convinced by their own pseudoscience while also serving broader cultural anxieties about sexuality. What's undeniable is the damage it caused. Generations of young people traumatized by guilt and fear. Children punished, restrained, even mutilated for normal developmental behavior. Adults carrying shame that affected their sexual relationships for life. You're lying in bed now, hands deliberately placed on top of the covers where you can see them. You're trying not to think about the urge. Trying to be good, pure, disciplined. You've promised yourself you'll stop. But the urge returns, insistent, natural. And eventually you give in. And immediately after, the shame crashes over you like a wave. You're weak. You're sinful. You're destroying yourself. You pray for forgiveness and strength. You resolve, again, to never do it again. Of course you will. Because it's not actually harmful. Because your body is functioning normally. Because adolescent sexuality is natural, not pathological. But nobody tells you that. Instead, you're sold cures. Patent medicines promising to restore your vigor, to repair the damage, to save you from the consequences of self-abuse. Tonics containing dubious ingredients. Electrical devices that claim to stimulate proper masculine energy. Special diets and exercise regimens. All expensive, all useless, all preying on fear and shame. The market for these products was enormous. Thousands of young men and their worried parents spending money on solutions to a problem that didn't exist. And the cycle reinforced itself. The more you were told masturbation was harmful, the more anxiety you felt. The more anxiety you felt, the more you looked for symptoms. The more symptoms you imagined, the more you sought cures. And the more cures you tried, the more you validated the original claim that there was something wrong. It was brilliant. In a horrifying way. A self-perpetuating system of shame and profit. You're older now, married, and you've discovered that the dire predictions didn't come true. You didn't go blind or insane. You didn't waste away. You're fine. Perfectly healthy, actually. And slowly, you realize you were lied to. That the panic was unfounded. That you spent years of your youth in unnecessary guilt and fear. The anger comes later. But first, there's just relief and confusion. Why did they lie? What was the point? The point was control. Control over young people's bodies and sexuality. Control over private behavior that threatened no one. Control disguised as medical concern and moral guidance. The Victorian obsession with sexual purity extended even to acts that involved no other person. Even your relationship with your own body had to be regulated, surveilled, punished. Nothing could be private. Nothing could be yours alone. Everything had to serve the larger project of civilized respectability. And if that required terrorizing children with lies about blindness and insanity, so be it. Let that anger settle for a moment. Feel the injustice of it. The cruelty of teaching young people to hate and fear their own bodies. The damage of building sexuality on a foundation of shame rather than knowledge. Then let it go. Those Victorian doctors and moralists are long gone. Their pseudoscience has been thoroughly debunked. Their frightening pamphlets are curiosities now, studied by historians who marvel at the absurdity. But the echoes remain. In every young person taught that their body is shameful. In every message that sexuality is dangerous rather than natural. In every system that prioritizes control over well-being. The Victorians didn't invent sexual shame, but they refined it, medicalized it, made it seem scientific and inevitable. And we're still unlearning their lessons, still fighting against the idea that our bodies are problems to be solved, still claiming the right to pleasure without punishment, still insisting that normal human sexuality isn't a disease. It's slow work, but it's happening, one generation at a time. Learning what the Victorians should have known, that we're not machines that break from use. We're humans, complex, sexual, alive. And that's not just okay. It's beautiful. Rest easy now. Your body is yours. Nothing to fear. Nothing to fix. Just breathe. Disease was everywhere. Silent, shameful, and devastating. You're a Victorian doctor, and you've just diagnosed another case. The patient sits across from you, face draining of color, as you explain. Syphilis. The word hangs in the air like a death sentence. Because in many ways it is. Here's the well-known fact. Venereal diseases, primarily syphilis and gonorrhea, were epidemic in Victorian England. Estimates suggest that up to 1 in 5 Londoners contracted syphilis at some point, and gonorrhea rates were similarly high. But treatment options were limited, dangerous, and often ineffective, while the social stigma meant many people delayed seeking help until the disease had progressed beyond cure. Your patient is asking about treatment. You explain the options, trying to sound more confident than you feel. Mercury treatments, the standard for syphilis. They might help. They might also poison him slowly with heavy metal toxicity. His teeth will fall out. His gums will turn black. He'll salivate uncontrollably. The phrase, mad as a hatter, came from mercury poisoning in hat makers. Your patient might end up similarly afflicted, but the alternative is letting the disease progress unchecked. Through its 3 stages, each worse than the last. First, the chancre, a painless sore that appears and then vanishes, fooling people into thinking they're cured. Then the rash, the fever, the lesions that can cover the entire body. Finally, years later, the tertiary stage, damage to the heart, brain, nervous system. Insanity, paralysis, death. Here's the eccentric curiosity. Some Victorian doctors deliberately infected patients with malaria to treat syphilis. The high fever from malaria supposedly killed the syphilis bacteria. This pyrotherapy sometimes worked, though patients then had to deal with malaria. The treatment wasn't entirely abandoned until antibiotics were discovered in the 20th century. The cruelty of venereal disease wasn't just physical. It was social and moral, because contracting these diseases marked you as immoral, dissolute, deserving of punishment. Never mind that many people, especially women, were infected by their own husbands who'd visited prostitutes. Never mind that children could be born with congenital syphilis through no fault of their own. The disease itself was seen as evidence of sin, a physical manifestation of moral corruption. And that belief made everything worse. You're a woman now, married 5 years. You've started experiencing symptoms, burning pain, unusual discharge. You're terrified to see a doctor because you know what he'll think, that you've been unfaithful, that you're a loose woman, that you deserve this. But you haven't been unfaithful. Your husband has, though you don't know it yet. He visited prostitutes before marriage, sowing his wild oats as men do. He contracted gonorrhea and thought he was cured because symptoms disappeared. But the bacteria remained dormant, waiting, and now he's infected you and possibly damaged your ability to have children. Gonorrhea frequently caused infertility in women. Historians still argue whether Victorian men genuinely didn't understand they were infecting their wives, or whether they understood but didn't care because wives had no recourse. Legally, a wife couldn't refuse her husband, and she couldn't divorce him for infecting her. You finally see a doctor. He examines you with barely concealed disgust. He assumes the worst about you. And when you insist you've been faithful, he doesn't believe you. Women lie, after all. Women are deceitful. And only moral women contract these diseases. The circular logic traps you perfectly. You're given douches containing harsh chemicals, zinc sulfate, alum, carbolic acid. They burn terribly and accomplish little. You're told to abstain from relations with your husband, but you can't tell him why without admitting you're diseased. And if he finds out, he might divorce you, claiming you brought disease into the marriage, even though he's the source. So you suffer in silence, like thousands of other women, infected by their husbands, blamed for their own victimization, unable to seek proper treatment without destroying their reputations. The children were perhaps the saddest cases. Babies born with congenital syphilis suffered horrifically. Deformities, blindness, cognitive impairments. Many died in infancy. Those who survived carried the marks of their parents' infection, or more accurately, their father's infection, since the disease almost always came through the male line. But the mothers were blamed. Bad blood, people whispered. Weak constitution. Improper behavior during pregnancy. Anything but acknowledging that respectable husbands were infecting their wives and children. You're in a hospital ward now, walking past beds filled with patients in various stages of disease. Some are in the early stages, still hopeful that treatment will work. Others are in the final stages, bodies destroyed, minds failing. Some are women who worked as prostitutes. They receive the worst care, treated with open contempt by staff. Others are respectable middle-class patients whose families have quietly committed them. There's no real difference in their suffering, but society treats them completely differently based on perceived morality. The prevention campaigns were grotesque. Rather than promoting condom use or honest sex education, authorities focused on moral purity. Young men were warned to avoid prostitutes through scare tactics. Pamphlets showed hideous images of disease-ravaged bodies. Lectures described in graphic detail the progression of symptoms. The message, this is what happens to sinners. But rarely, this is how to protect yourself. Because teaching prevention would acknowledge that people would have sex outside marriage. And that was unacceptable. Better to let people suffer and die than compromise on moral principles. By the 1890s, some progressive doctors began advocating for condom use and honest education. They were denounced as immoral, as encouraging vice. Medical journals published stern rebuttals. Clergy preached against them, and the epidemic continued. Let that preventable suffering settle. The unnecessary deaths, the destroyed families, the children born into illness. All because Victorian society valued moral posturing over human well-being. All because they couldn't acknowledge sexual reality. All because shame was more important than health. It's dark, this part of the story. Darker than the others, perhaps. Because disease is indiscriminate. It doesn't care about morality. It doesn't distinguish between the deserving and undeserving. It just spreads, silent and devastating. And the Victorians let it spread rather than confront their own hypocrisy. Take a deep breath. You're safe from those Victorian diseases now. Medicine has advanced. Antibiotics can cure what mercury couldn't. Knowledge has replaced much of the shame. Not all. Stigma still exists. But the death sentence is gone. And that's something. A small victory against the darkness. Rest now. Let the weight of this lift. Tomorrow there will be light again. But tonight, just acknowledge what was lost. And be grateful for what's changed. Sex education meant scare tactics. Pure, undiluted terror. You're 14 years old, sitting in a lecture hall with other young people. The speaker is a medical man, or perhaps a minister. The line between the two is often blurred. He's here to educate you about the facts of life. But what you're about to hear has very little to do with facts, and everything to do with fear. Here's the well-known fact. Victorian sex education, when it existed at all, focused almost exclusively on the dangers of sexual activity rather than providing accurate information. Young people were warned about disease, insanity, moral corruption, and death, but rarely told basic facts about anatomy, reproduction, or healthy sexuality. The goal was deterrence, not education. The speaker begins with a story. A young man, much like yourselves, who gave in to temptation. First, he masturbated, and you've already heard about those consequences. Then he visited a prostitute, just once, just out of curiosity. Within weeks, he developed symptoms. Within months, he was covered in sores. Within a year, he was insane. He died at 23. The speaker intones solemnly, a lesson to all who would stray from the path of purity. The story is probably fabricated, or at least heavily embellished, but it's effective. You and your fellow students sit in horrified silence. Here's the eccentric curiosity. Some Victorian educators used preserved specimens of diseased organs in jars. Kidneys destroyed by syphilis, brains damaged by late-stage disease, as visual aids in their lectures. Young people were forced to examine these grotesque displays while listening to descriptions of how moral failure led to physical destruction. The psychological impact was often traumatic. The lecturer moves on to reproduction, but he doesn't explain it clearly. He uses euphemisms, vague language, biblical references. You leave understanding that something happens between married people that results in children, but you're not entirely clear what that something is. You know it involves sin if done outside marriage. You know it can lead to disease and death. You know women can be ruined by it. You know men must control themselves. But the actual mechanics, the biology, the emotional component, these remain mysterious. And that's intentional. Knowledge is dangerous, the Victorians believed. Ignorance is protection. If you don't know what sex is, you can't desire it. If you don't understand your body, you can't misuse it. The logic was flawed, obviously. Ignorance didn't prevent sexual activity. It just made it more dangerous, more guilt-ridden, more likely to result in harm. Historians still argue whether Victorian educators genuinely believed scare tactics worked, or whether they knew education was ineffective but preferred that outcome to young people having accurate sexual knowledge. Probably most believe their approach was best, while also being relieved that it kept topics uncomfortable to discuss vague and brief. You're a young woman now, receiving your mother's version of sex education. The night before your wedding, she finally speaks to you about what to expect. But even now, with marriage imminent, she can't be direct. Your husband will have certain rights, she begins. You must submit to him, as the Bible commands. It may be uncomfortable at first, but that's natural. Close your eyes and think of pleasant things. Never refuse him, or you'll drive him to sin. That's it. That's the sum total of your preparation for married sexual life. You have questions, so many questions, but asking them would be improper. Admitting curiosity would mark you as unwomanly. So you nod and thank her for her guidance. And tomorrow you'll marry, still fundamentally ignorant of what marriage entails. The books that might have helped were illegal or unavailable. Medical texts were written for doctors, not lay people. And anything accessible was either pornographic, focused on fantasy, not reality, or moralistic, focused on prohibition rather than information. There was almost nothing in between. No honest, practical, compassionate guides to sexuality. No acknowledgement that people might need information to have healthy, satisfying sexual lives. Just silence and shame and the occasional terrifying lecture. Some people did try to provide better education. Reformers like Annie Besant published pamphlets on reproduction and contraception. Progressive doctors wrote marriage manuals that attempted honesty. But these were controversial, often prosecuted under obscenity laws. And they reached only a small fraction of the population. Most Victorians navigated sexuality in near-total ignorance, learning through trial and error, through whispered conversations with friends, through traumatic wedding nights and painful misunderstandings. The cost was enormous. Marriages damaged by sexual dysfunction rooted in ignorance and shame. Women suffering from preventable gynecological problems because they didn't know their own anatomy. Men aggressive or clumsy because no one taught them that sex could involve communication and care. Couples never experiencing pleasure because neither partner knew pleasure was possible or acceptable. And through it all, the same message echoing. Sex is dangerous, shameful, dirty. Something to be endured, not enjoyed. Something that happens in darkness and silence. Something never discussed in daylight. You're drifting now between that Victorian lecture hall and the present, thinking about how recently this changed. How many people alive today received Victorian-style sex education, or no education at all? How the echoes of that silence still ripple forward. In every person who learned about sex from pornography, because no one would teach them honestly. In every young person ashamed of normal questions. In every adult still carrying guilt learned in childhood. The damage persists, but slowly, gradually it's healing. Each generation that chooses honesty over shame. Each parent who answers questions directly. Each educator who provides facts instead of fear. Each person who refuses to pass trauma forward. It's slow work. The Victorians built those walls of silence high and thick. But walls can be dismantled, one honest conversation at a time. One book, one class, one acknowledgement that sexuality is human at a time. And maybe that's the most Victorian thing we're still fighting. The belief that silence protects. That ignorance is innocence. That not talking about something makes it go away. It doesn't. It never did. The Victorians had just as much sex as any other era. They just had it in confusion, fear, and shame. And that helped no one. So rest now, knowing that you live in an imperfect but more honest time, where questions can be asked, where answers can be found, where bodies don't have to be mysteries to the people living in them. It's not perfect, but it's progress. And progress, however slow, is something. Let that comfort carry you into gentler dreams, where knowledge is light, not danger, where bodies are homes, not battlegrounds, where you can simply be human and whole. Breathe easy. But change was coming. Slowly, painfully, but inevitably. You're at a public meeting in London, 1890s. The hall is packed, standing room only. On stage, a woman is speaking, not whispering in parlors or writing under a pseudonym. Speaking publicly, boldly, about women's rights, about bodies and choices and autonomy, about everything Victorian society says women shouldn't discuss. She's a new woman, and she's terrifying to the establishment. Here's the well-known fact. The late Victorian era saw the rise of the new woman, educated, politically active, often unmarried by choice. These women demanded access to higher education, entry into professions, the right to own property after marriage, divorce reform, and crucially, control over their own bodies. They challenged every assumption about female nature that Victorian society held sacred. The speaker is discussing marriage laws, how a woman's property becomes her husband's upon marriage, how she has no legal right to refuse him sexually, how she cannot divorce him for cruelty, infidelity, or even infecting her with disease, how she's legally invisible, subsumed into his identity. The audience is mixed in its reaction. Some women cheer, nodding vigorously. Others look scandalized. Nice women don't discuss such things publicly. The men present are largely hostile, shouting interruptions. But the speaker doesn't stop. She's been arrested before for her activism. She'll likely be arrested again. But she keeps speaking. Here's the eccentric curiosity. Some new women adopted rational dress, shortened skirts, bloomers, and eventually trousers, which scandalized Victorian society almost as much as their political demands. Dress reform was seen as connected to sexual and political freedom. Controlling women's clothing was another way to control women's bodies and movements. Some restaurants and theaters refused entry to women in rational dress. You're a new woman yourself now. You've attended university, one of the few that admits women. You work as a teacher or perhaps a journalist. You've chosen not to marry, at least not yet, and you're actively campaigning for changes. For the Married Women's Property Act, which would let wives control their own earnings. For expansion of divorce grounds beyond adultery. For repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts. Remember those forced examinations? For raising the age of consent. Remember those 12-year-old brides? Every campaign is a battle against legislators who think women's brains are too small for politics, against doctors who claim education will damage women's reproductive systems, against clergy who insist women's place is in the home, subordinate to husbands, against newspapers that mock and belittle every demand. Historians still argue whether the New Woman movement was primarily middle class and therefore limited in its impact on working-class women's lives. It's true that many leaders were educated and financially comfortable. But working-class women were also organizing through trade unions and socialist movements, demanding economic as well as legal changes. The sexual politics are particularly contentious. Some new women advocate for celibacy, refusing to engage with a sexual system that oppresses women. Others demand that married women have the right to refuse sex and control their own fertility. A few, more radical, suggest that women might enjoy sexuality if it weren't wrapped in subordination and shame. This last idea is considered outrageous. Female sexual pleasure? Impossible, unwomanly, pathological. But you've been reading the new literature quietly circulating. Works by Havelock Ellis, who suggests sexuality is natural and varied for both sexes. Edward Carpenter's writings about homosexuality and sexual diversity. Even some European sexologists who acknowledge female desire. These ideas are revolutionary. They suggest that the entire Victorian sexual system is built on lies. That women aren't naturally passionless. That men aren't uncontrollable beasts. That sexuality could be mutual, pleasurable, negotiated between equals. The implications are staggering. You're writing an article now for Progressive magazine. Carefully worded. You can't be too explicit or you'll be prosecuted for obscenity. But arguing that women deserve education about their own bodies. That sex within marriage should be consensual, not obligatory. That women's health matters as much as male pleasure. That marriage should be a partnership, not ownership. Revolutionary ideas, framed as moderately as possible. Even so, when it's published, you receive hate mail. Threats, accusations of being unwomanly, suggestions that you're bitter because no man wants you. The standard attacks against women who speak publicly. You file them away and keep writing. Because the alternative is silence. And silence has served women poorly. The Contagious Diseases Acts are repealed in 1886, a major victory. The age of consent is raised to 16 in 1885. The Married Women's Property Act passes in stages, finally giving wives full property rights in 1882. Each victory is hard-won and incomplete, but they're victories nonetheless. Proof that change is possible, that speaking up matters, that the Victorian system, for all its appearance of permanence, can be challenged. You attend a suffrage rally now. Votes for women, the ultimate goal. It won't be achieved in the Victorian era. That will take until 1918, and even then only for women over 30. Full equality will take until 1928. But the foundation is being laid. Women marching in the streets. Women chaining themselves to railings. Women enduring prison, force-feeding, violence. all to claim the basic right to participate in governance. And woven through the suffrage movement is the sexual revolution, because voting rights and bodily autonomy are connected. If women are full citizens, they must have control over their own bodies. If they're equals, they can't be sexual property. If they're rational beings, they can make their own choices about marriage, reproduction, sexuality. The logic is inescapable, which is why it's so fiercely resisted. Let that resistance wash over you now. Feel the weight of it. Every woman who spoke up and was silenced. Every demand that was denied. Every step forward that took decades of effort. The new women were called unnatural, hysterical, dangerous. They were accused of wanting to destroy marriage and family, of being man-haters or secretly desiring to be men, of threatening civilization itself. The same accusations that would be leveled at feminists for generations. But they persisted, and slowly, grudgingly, the Victorian certainties began to crack. Not because men suddenly became enlightened, but because women refused to accept the status quo. Because they organized, wrote, spoke, marched, and demanded. Because they made themselves impossible to ignore. And because some men, not enough but some, recognized the injustice and joined the cause. By the time Queen Victoria died in 1901, the world was changing. The Victorian era was ending. And with it, some of the worst excesses of Victorian sexual repression. Not all. Progress is never linear. Not quickly. It would take most of the 20th century to dismantle what the Victorians built. But the trajectory was set toward more honesty, more equality, more recognition of women as full human beings with desires, rights, and autonomy. The new women started something they wouldn't live to see completed. But they started it. And that matters. Rest now in their courage, in their refusal to accept what they were told was natural and inevitable, in their insistence that a better world was possible. They were right. Slowly, painfully, but inevitably, they were right. And you're living in the world they fought for. Imperfect still, but immeasurably better than the one they inherited. Sleep now, grateful. And then everything came crashing down in a single, spectacular scandal. Oscar Wilde. The name still echoes with tragedy, brilliance, and the price of visibility. You're in London, 1895. The newspapers are full of it. The most celebrated playwright of the age, arrested and on trial. Not for his plays, which charmed society, but for loving men. Here's the well-known fact. Oscar Wilde was prosecuted for gross indecency in 1895 after the Marquis of Queensberry publicly accused him of being a sodomite, misspelled on the calling card. Wilde sued for libel, lost, and was then prosecuted himself. The trials became a media sensation, exposing Victorian hypocrisy about homosexuality and destroying one of the era's greatest literary talents. The trial transcripts make devastating reading. Wilde tried to defend himself with wit and eloquence. He spoke of the love that dare not speak its name, the love between an older and younger man, found in the works of Plato and Michelangelo. He argued it was intellectual, spiritual, beautiful. The prosecutor twisted his words, paraded male prostitutes and servants as witnesses, detailed encounters in hotels, in private rooms, made something private and tender into something sordid and criminal. The public was scandalized and fascinated. The courtroom was packed every day. Here's the eccentric curiosity. During Wilde's trial, thousands of British men fled to the continent, Paris, Italy, anywhere that enforcement was less strict. The trials created a panic that authorities might start prosecuting homosexual activity more broadly. Some men destroyed letters, burned diaries, severed ties with close friends to avoid suspicion. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was 2 years hard labor, the maximum allowed under the law. Wilde entered prison as a celebrated artist. He emerged broken in health and spirit. You're reading his letter now, written from prison to Profundus. It's a meditation on suffering, love, art, and betrayal. The man who loved his partner, Lord Alfred Douglas, with consuming passion. The man whose love was used as evidence against him. The man who lost everything, career, reputation, family, freedom, for loving openly. The prose is beautiful and heartbreaking. I don't regret for a single moment having lived for pleasure. I did it to the full. There was no pleasure I did not experience. But also, I've got to make everything that has happened to me good for me. Trying to find meaning in persecution. Trying to transform suffering into art. Historians still argue whether Wilde's prosecution was primarily about class anxiety, an Irish upstart daring to seduce aristocratic young men, or genuine moral outrage, or political convenience. Probably all three, with his visibility and refusal to hide, making him an ideal target. What's undeniable is the chilling effect. After Wilde, homosexual men became even more careful, more closeted. The brief possibility that intense male friendships might be acceptable evaporated. Suspicion fell on any man who seemed too artistic, too effeminate, too close to his male friends. And the law remained in place for another 70 years. Until 1967, men could be imprisoned for the same acts that destroyed Wilde. Some were. Alan Turing, the genius who helped crack the Enigma code and save countless lives in World War II, was prosecuted in 1952. He chose chemical castration over prison. He died 2 years later, probably by suicide, for being gay. In the 1950s, the line from Wilde to Turing to countless unnamed men is direct and tragic. Victorian laws, Victorian attitudes, Victorian cruelty, persisting decades after Victoria's death. You're standing outside Reading Jail now, where Wilde was imprisoned, imagining him inside those walls. The man who wrote, "We are all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars." The man who created unforgettable plays and devastating poems. The man whose only crime was loving as he loved. He died in Paris in 1900, 3 years after release. Bankrupt, exiled, broken. He was 46 years old. His last words, allegedly, "Either that wallpaper goes, or I do." Wit persisting even to the end. But the wit couldn't save him from what Victorian society did to him. The trial exposed everything the Victorians wanted to hide. That homosexuality existed in their midst in high society. That the men they celebrated might love other men. That their neat categories of masculinity and propriety were fictions. And their response was to destroy the man who made invisibility impossible. To make an example of him. To say, this is what happens when you refuse to hide. The lesson was learned by a generation. But here's what they didn't anticipate. Wilde became a martyr. His trials, his suffering, his grace under persecution, they became rallying points. Not immediately, but eventually. When future generations looked back, they didn't see a criminal. They saw a victim of unjust laws. An artist destroyed by hypocritical moralism. A human being punished for being human. And that recognition helped change the world. Not quickly enough for Wilde. Not quickly enough for the thousands who suffered under the same laws. But change came, because Wilde's trials made the cost of repression visible, made the cruelty undeniable, made it impossible to pretend that criminalizing love protected anyone. Let yourself feel that tragedy now. The waste of it, the brilliant mind silenced, the beautiful words that were never written because the writer was broken, the love that was criminalized, the life that was destroyed, and multiply it by thousands. Because Wilde was just the most famous. But every gay man in Victorian England lived under that same threat. Every lesbian woman, though invisible to the law, still faced social destruction if discovered. Every person who didn't fit the narrow definitions of acceptable sexuality. All of them living in fear, in hiding, in shame. Because society decided their love was criminal. The Victorian era is ending now. Victoria herself will die in 1901. And with her death, an era ends. But the laws remain. The attitudes persist. The damage continues. It will take most of the 20th century to undo what the 19th century built. And even now, the work isn't finished. But Wilde's story, tragic as it is, matters. Because he refused to be invisible. He lived openly, loved boldly, created brilliantly. And yes, he paid terribly for it. But his refusal to hide cracked something open, made future visibility possible, proved that even Victorian certainty could be challenged. Rest now, thinking of Oscar, of his wit, his talent, his courage, his suffering, of all the people like him lost to history, of the slow, painful progress toward a world where love doesn't have to be criminal, where people can be themselves without persecution, where difference is celebrated, not punished. That world is still imperfect, still being built, but it's closer than it was, thanks partly to those who refused to hide, who paid the price, who showed that another way was possible, even if they didn't live to see it. Sleep now. Dream of a kinder world, the one Oscar imagined but never saw, the one we're still building, one honest moment at a time. The Victorian world is ending now, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a slow fade into something new. You're in London, January 1901. Queen Victoria has died after 63 years on the throne, the longest reign in British history, an entire era defined by her name. And with her death, the century turns. The Edwardian age begins, shorter, lighter, less suffocating. But the Victorian legacy lingers like smoke in fabric. Here's the well-known fact. Victoria's death in 1901 marked not just the end of a reign, but the symbolic end of an era. The strict moral codes, the sexual repression, the rigid social hierarchies, all began to relax in the early 20th century. But the attitudes Victoria's era created didn't disappear overnight. They persisted in laws, institutions, and the minds of people raised under Victorian values. You're watching the funeral procession. Black horses, black carriages, miles of mourning crowds. An empire grieving its matriarch. But beneath the grief, there's something else. A sense of release, perhaps. A feeling that a heavy blanket has been lifted, just slightly. The Edwardians will dance more freely. Women's skirts will rise, just a few inches, but symbolically significant. Divorce will become slightly more accessible. Conversations about sex will become marginally more honest. The suffragettes will become more militant, more visible. Change is accelerating. Here's the eccentric curiosity. In the years immediately after Victoria's death, there was a brief boom in modern marriages where couples experimented with more equal partnerships. Some called them companionate marriages, based on friendship and mutual respect rather than duty and hierarchy. Critics called them dangerous and unnatural, but they represented early attempts to reimagine what marriage could be. But the Victorian worldview doesn't die easily. Those children raised in Victorian households carry those values into the 20th century. They become the parents and grandparents who perpetuate the sexual shame, who warn their daughters about men's animal urges, who never discuss bodies or pleasure or consent, who maintain that nice people simply don't talk about such things. Historians still argue whether the real break from Victorian sexual attitudes came in the 1920s, the 1960s, or is still ongoing. Probably it's a gradual process, with different aspects changing at different speeds in different communities. You're reading a book now, published in 1918. Marie Stopes' Married Love, one of the first honest guides to marital sexuality. It acknowledges female desire. It discusses techniques for mutual pleasure. It suggests that sex should be enjoyable for both partners. Revolutionary concepts. The book is immediately controversial, condemned by the church, debated in Parliament. But it also becomes a bestseller because people are hungry for this information, desperate for permission to enjoy their bodies, eager to escape the Victorian prison of shame and silence. Stopes receives thousands of letters from grateful readers. Women who had no idea their bodies could feel pleasure. Men who had no idea their wives weren't objects to be used. Couples discovering, after years of marriage, that sex could be mutual and joyful. Better late than never. But imagine if they'd known sooner. Imagine if the Victorians had allowed honest education, open discussion, acknowledgement of sexuality as natural. How much suffering could have been prevented? How many lives could have been happier? But dwelling on what might have been is futile. The past is fixed. What matters is what comes next. You're in the 1920s now, the roaring 20s. Women bobbed their hair, wear shorter skirts, dance the Charleston. Some even smoke and drink in public. Shocking behavior by Victorian standards. The flappers represent rebellion against everything Victorian, against restriction, propriety, the idea that women should be pure and passive. They're claiming bodies, pleasure, public space. Not all women, of course. Many still live by Victorian rules. And the backlash is fierce. Moralists condemn modern women as degenerate, warn that civilization is collapsing, predict doom if traditional values aren't restored. The same warnings that greeted every feminist advance. But the genie is out of the bottle. Women have tasted freedom, the vote, education, employment, some control over their reproduction. They're not going back. The Second World War accelerates change even more. Women in factories, in military service, in positions of authority. Men and women mixing more freely. Relationships forming outside traditional channels. And after the war, the baby boom, but also the beginning of the sexual revolution. By the 1960s, the Victorian worldview is genuinely dying. Birth control becomes widely available. Abortion laws liberalize. Homosexuality is decriminalized in England in 1967. Remember Oscar Wilde? It took 72 years after his trial. Divorce becomes accessible. Sex education, while still imperfect, becomes more honest. And people start talking about pleasure, about consent, about the damage that shame causes, about how the Victorian legacy harmed everyone, not just women, though they bore the worst, not just gay people, though they suffered terribly, everyone who learned to fear their own bodies, everyone taught that desire was shameful, everyone trapped in the gap between human reality and impossible ideals. You're here now, in the present, looking back at the Victorian era from more than a century away. And you can see both how far we've come and how far we still have to go. Some Victorian attitudes persist. The idea that women's sexuality is problematic, dangerous, needing control. The double standards around promiscuity. The shame around bodies and natural functions. The difficulty discussing sex honestly, even in medical contexts. The stigma around sexual diversity. These aren't uniquely Victorian. They existed before Victoria and persist after. But the Victorians refined them, systematized them, wrapped them in the authority of science and medicine. And we're still unlearning their lessons, still fighting for bodily autonomy, still insisting that pleasure isn't sinful, still claiming the right to desire without shame, still demanding that people of all orientations and identities be treated as fully human. The work continues, but take a moment to acknowledge the progress. Victorian women couldn't vote, couldn't own property in marriage, couldn't refuse sex, couldn't access birth control legally, couldn't divorce except in extreme circumstances. Victorian gay people were criminal subject to imprisonment and persecution. Victorian children received no honest sex education and faced brutal cures for normal behavior. Victorian attitudes towards sexuality were built on lies, maintained through fear, and enforced through law. All of that has changed. Imperfectly, incompletely, but genuinely. The change came through the courage of people who refused to accept the status quo. The new women who demanded rights. The doctors who provided honest information despite legal risk. The writers who spoke truth. The ordinary people who quietly lived their lives with dignity despite oppression. All of them pushed against the Victorian certainties. And eventually, those certainties cracked. Let that progress settle over you now like a warm blanket. You're safe in a world the Victorians built. But you're also safe in a world that has dismantled some of their cruelest structures and is still working to dismantle the rest. Rest in that knowledge. That change is possible. That progress, while slow, is real. That those Victorian bedrooms, with all their shame and silence and suffering, their history now, lessons to learn from, warnings to heed, but not prophecies of inevitable future. We could do better. We're doing better. And tomorrow, we'll continue. But tonight, just rest. In gratitude for those who fought. In hope for those still fighting. In peace for this moment. The Victorian era is over. Long over. And you survived it. Or rather, you inherited a world beyond it. Breathe that in and let it go. And now it's time to close the door on those Victorian bedrooms. To step back from the gaslit streets and the parlors heavy with secrets. To let the weight of all that repression, all that suffering, all that courage, to let it settle into history where it belongs. You've walked through an entire world tonight. A world of contradictions and cruelty wrapped in lace and respectability. You've seen the marriage beds that were battlegrounds. The doctors who invaded the most intimate spaces with their ignorance disguised as expertise. The streets where women sold their bodies just to survive. The laws that claimed ownership of women's bodies in the name of public health. The children, so young, so vulnerable, whose innocence was sacrificed to adult hypocrisy. You've stood with men who loved men, living in constant fear of discovery and destruction. You've sat with women who loved women, finding ways to build lives together in the spaces society couldn't quite see. You've witnessed the underground networks of contraception and abortion, desperate measures for desperate circumstances. You've seen the pornography that thrived in the shadows of a society that denied sexuality existed. The virginity cult that made women's bodies into commodities. The myth of savage male sexuality that excused exploitation and violence. The masturbation panic that terrorized young people with lies. The venereal diseases that spread silently, blamed on morality rather than biology. The sex education that taught fear instead of knowledge. And you've met the rebels. The new women who demanded to be treated as full human beings. Oscar Wilde, who refused to hide his love even when it cost him everything. The ordinary people who quietly resisted, who found moments of tenderness and pleasure despite everything society told them. And you've seen how slowly, painfully, through the courage of countless individuals, the Victorian certainties began to crumble. How the 20th century gradually dismantled what the 19th had built. How we're still, even now, unlearning those lessons in shame. It's been a heavy journey through that world. But you've reached the end now, and you can let it go. Let those Victorian voices fade. Let their judgments lose their power. Let their certainties dissolve into the past where they belong. Because here's what the Victorians got wrong, fundamentally wrong. They believed that denying human sexuality would make people purer, safer, better. They believed that silence was protection, that ignorance was innocence, that shame would guide people toward virtue. They were wrong. All that denial and silence and shame accomplished was suffering. It didn't make people less sexual. It just made them confused and frightened about their sexuality. It didn't protect the vulnerable. It made them more vulnerable, easier to exploit. It didn't create virtue. It created hypocrisy, a vast gap between public performance and private reality. And the cost was enormous. Lives damaged, potential unrealized, happiness sacrificed on the altar of respectability. But those lives mattered. Every Victorian woman who endured what she was told was her duty. Every man trapped between desire and law. Every child taught to fear their own body. Every person who loved in secret, who survived despite the system designed to crush them. They all mattered. Their suffering wasn't meaningless. It taught us, slowly, eventually, what not to do. It showed us the cost of repression. It proved that you cannot build a healthy society on lies about human nature. And so we've changed. Not completely, not perfectly, but genuinely. We've learned to talk more honestly about bodies and pleasure and consent. We've recognized that people come in more varieties than Victorian categories allowed. We've given people more control over their own lives and bodies. We've replaced some of the shame with knowledge, some of the fear with compassion. The work continues. There are still battles being fought over bodily autonomy and sexual freedom. Still people being harmed by outdated attitudes and unjust laws. Still shame being taught and fear being spread. The Victorian ghosts haven't entirely left us, but they're fading. Generation by generation, conversation by conversation, honest moment by honest moment, they're fading. And in their place, something better is slowly emerging. Not perfect, but better. A world where people can be more fully themselves. Where bodies are homes, not prisons. Where love in its many forms can be celebrated rather than criminalized. Where pleasure isn't sinful and desire isn't shameful. Where we can be human in all our messy, complicated, beautiful humanity. That's the world those Victorian rebels fought for. The new women and the writers and the doctors who risked everything to provide honest information. The ordinary people who quietly lived their lives with dignity despite oppression. They didn't see the world they were building. Most of them died long before the real changes came. But they planted seeds. Seeds that grew slowly through decades of struggle and setback and gradual progress. And now we're living in the garden they began. Still tending it, still pulling weeds, still planting new seeds for future generations. But living in it nonetheless. So as you drift towards sleep now, let yourself feel grateful. Grateful that you weren't born into that Victorian world, with all its restrictions and cruelties. Grateful for the people who fought so you could have more freedom. Grateful that some battles have been won, even as others continue. And let yourself feel hopeful, too. Because if the Victorian certainties could crumble, if that massive edifice of repression could be dismantled piece by piece, then no injustice is permanent. No wrong is inevitable. Change is always possible if people are willing to fight for it. The Victorians built their world carefully, deliberately, convinced it would last forever. And it did last for a while. But it ended. Everything ends, eventually. Even systems that seem eternal. Even attitudes that seem unchangeable. Everything is temporary, including oppression. Let that truth comfort you as you slip into deeper rest. As your breathing slows and your thoughts soften and the story fades. You're safe here now in this moment. The Victorian bedrooms are empty. The gaslit streets are dark. The voices have gone silent. What remains are just memories. Important memories, necessary memories, but memories nonetheless. You can visit them when you need to remember where we've been and how far we've come. But you don't have to live there. You can step back into your own time, your own life, your own body. You can claim the freedoms that were fought for. You can be yourself, whoever that is, however you love, whatever brings you joy. You can refuse to pass Victorian shame forward to the next generation. You can be part of the healing, the change, the slow building of something better. Or you can simply rest. That's enough, too. Just resting, breathing, being, knowing that you're safe, that you're enough, that your body is yours. That desire isn't dangerous, and pleasure isn't sinful, and being human is perfectly, beautifully sufficient. The Victorians couldn't believe that, couldn't accept that simple truth. But you can. So let their world fade completely now, dissolving like fog in morning light. Let the weight lift. Let the shadows recede. Let your mind empty of everything except breath, heartbeat, the gentle pull of sleep. You've traveled far tonight through difficult territory, but you've arrived safely home. To this moment, to this breath, to this peaceful, drifting, deepening rest. And as you sink into dreams, let them be gentle ones. Not of Victorian bedrooms or gaslit streets, but of morning light and open spaces. Of freedom and possibility and hope. Of the world we're still building together, one honest conversation at a time. Sweet dreams, dear traveler. You've earned them. The story is finished. The Victorian era is over. And you're safe here now, forever and always. Rest well. Sweet dreams.